just that good.
Yeah. Raining a couple of hours.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
I love it.
Okay. I've got my rain gauge there, so we'll watch it. But there's a huge difference between soils that are healthy and soils that are sick. And the easiest way to demonstrate that is with this little thing that we call a stability test. This is a chunk of soil that we consistently steal soil from the agronomy farm at Stillwater. The university soil, they've got farmland that's been plowed and tilled every year for 100 years. It's been growing nothing but wheat. And so we use that for this demonstration. But that's not actually natural structure, it's a clod. And we like to see what happens when we drop it in the water and it's dry and air starts to flood in that soil. And you can see that how it's starting to react, it's kind of falling apart. But this is a clod, this is not a clod, this is structure. This comes from a farm up by Coyle, north of the river, that used to look like that, but hadn't been plowed in over 15 years. And this farmer's been producing a variety of crops: wheat, corn, cotton, grain sorghum, soybeans, canola, some other things I can't even remember. And he adds cover crops and his cattle harvest a little.
Would you call it a no-till system?
It is a no-till system where they quit plowing. And so because that soil is stable, it normally acts differently because it's had time to heal. And we'll talk a little bit about that healing process. Farmers began to discover these things, and then scientists came along to ask the why it works question. And what some girls in North Dakota discovered was that when you quit stirring the soil, and it doesn't matter what the land use is, when you leave that soil stable, there's an underground network of natural fungus that regrows and redevelops and rebuilds its population. And one of the proteins that coats that fungus persists in the soil. It builds up year by year to where it can make up 20% of the organic material in this soil. And this particular little fungus is like a glue. And as it grows, as it builds up in the soil, it glues the soil together, it rebuilds the aggregates, it creates little clumps of soil, and it regulates water moving in and out of it. And rather than having a soil that acts like rock, we're rebuilding a soil that acts like a sponge. But it's not a sponge that's very soft, it's actually a sponge, but it's strong. Very counterintuitive to those of us who grew up in an environment where you had to plow everything to get it soft to plant. What we've done is rebuild a soil that is stronger for me, that has more porosity, because along with that fungus, we have all these different kind of roots that grow and decay. We have earthworms that recolonize these sites. They build, we call them macropores, people call them earthworm burrows. But what they're building is super highways for air and water. When it rains on this field, in a couple of hours we'll have water 8 feet deep in the soil. And then that water will move out into the matrix of the soil and store that water where the crop can use it and keep it safe away from sun and wind and rain. And typically these farmers leave a lot of stuff on top. We call it residue. Other folks think it looks like weeds. But what it is insulation. It's protection. If you ever lived in a house without insulation, you know the difference between insulation and no insulation. Soil is exactly the same way. And we'll have a good demonstration of it over here. In terms of water quality, this environment, this ecosystem that we're building, we talk about restoring ecosystem function. We're not restoring the ecosystems back to their perfect and original plant composition and management, but we're building ecosystems that have a stable soil. They have a diversity of plants. Even if it's an agronomic use of plants, we end up with grasses and forbs and legumes, some for harvest, some for soil improvement. So we get diversity, and we also leave a lot of material on top. You took your walk. Most of this soil is pretty armored with material on top. And finally, in nature, there's never a season when it's not green out in the native range. I had to answer that question for myself a couple of Januaries ago, and you can go out in any typical native range. There's grasses, forbs, and legumes all through the winter. Those cool season components are there. So we can rebuild an ecosystem where nutrients move year-round, where that soil stays within the limits of biological temperature activity year-round. That bare soil over there in July will be way over 100 degrees in temperature. And when it gets to be 110, everything dies. All of the bacteria, all the fungus, a lot of the little life forms, one-celled organisms and insects, they die when it gets that hot. But that pan on the right that has that grass will stay 75 or 80 degrees all summer and continue to grow and move nutrients and support the plants that I think are what is important. Now, let's go back to water quality. Would you rather have water that runs off of a field clean, or water that runs off of a field like this? All of these little clay particles disperse, and when we send dirty water downstream, not only are we sending the sediment, but along with that sediment, we're sending the phosphorus that's hooked to that sediment. We're sending organic material that's being carried along with that sediment. We're carrying any of the herbicides and pesticides that bind to that sediment downstream. So any event where I lose soil is a loss for the producer, obviously, isn't it? Has it rained enough? Oh, it's rained plenty. Let's stop it raining. We'll continue to talk over here. Well, I sure did talk a long time.